Hi, and welcome to another edition of ASCAP Screen Time. I'm Mike Todd with the ASCAP Film and Television membership team, and I'm truly honored to introduce to you Branford Marsalis and Marco Williams, who are the composer-director team behind the film Tulsa Burning, the 1921 race massacre on the History Channel. Marco, you're an award-winning director with a number of documentaries that cover racial tensions focused on specific historical events across America. This doc in particular reveals rare archival footage and imagery from the massacre at the time, coupled with present-day interviews from historians, along with interviews from survivors over the past few decades. But most importantly, it also covers how the impact of this historical event is still being felt today and why it deserves so much attention. Branford, you've been a well-established saxophonist for many decades with a tremendously successful musical career. As a jazz and classical performer and band leader, you've composed music for Broadway and for films like Henrietta Lacks and more recently Ma Rainey's Black Bottom. And this year you scored this documentary, Tulsa Burning. So my first question is, given its subject matter and timing of the current greater dialogue happening within our culture, how important was this collaboration for each of you to tell this story?
I'll begin. Thank you, Michael, for the introduction. Very important. It was very important for me to tell this story. It's a significant part of our history. It's about the tremendous aspiration and achievement of African Americans. It's about the horrendous destruction of a community, and it's about the failure to repair that community. And I couldn't think of a more important historical story to be able to present today because of its resonance and reverberation to where we are and what is going on with our nation today.
Marco, that leads me to, why did you approach Branford to develop the score for this film? And how did you know that he was the right person for the job?
I didn't.
Fair enough.
He became the absolute best person for the job as we actually got to do the job. I hope you don't want this to be terribly serious. I mean, it is a very terribly serious topic, but it's also a journey that has sublime and ridiculousness involved. Look, Branford noted, and some of you may see in the background there is a poster for a fiction film called Without a Past that I did in 1991. The agents involved thought that it needed a little panache, and Branford was, I believe, the band leader or music director for The Tonight Show with Jay Leno. They reached out to him because he had, I think, fledgling interest in acting, and he was invited to be a player in the script and write the music, and that really was the foundation of a friendship that really kind of crisscrossed. Village Vanguard, here or there, we'd see each other, say hello. And I've always wanted to collaborate once more with Branford. And so when this opportunity presented itself, I said to history, I know somebody who would be really great for this. And I mentioned Branford, and they were very excited by the idea. And maybe, for all the bad fortune of COVID, the good fortune was that Branford was actually available.
Wow. Well, I guess that leads me to Branford. And how did you approach the film for the first recording date? Like just jumping right into it. What themes were in your head knowing the film's subject matter before even seeing the footage, I hear, right?
Yeah, well, due to the realities of filmmaking, it's just sometimes, shit happens. And we had this hard date that the History Channel said in the negotiations, we need to have the music by this date in January. And I remember the exact date. So I already knew that because it was music from the 20s, that the best musicians to hire were musicians from New Orleans. Because it's one of the few cities left where they play in that style. What I like to call it is outside voices. All musicians in the 20s had outside voices more than inside voices because there was no air conditioning. So half of the time they were playing outside. There's a different sound to an instrument when the musicians play outside as opposed to when the musicians play inside. And amongst other reasons, I thought that they would be perfect. And there are very few people, even in New Orleans, who do this well. So I had to hire them and lock them in. And once they were locked in, which is an experience I had on a prior project, I was working on Ma Rainey's Black Bottom, where the timeline shifted. And once we released the musicians, a third of them, I couldn't get them back. So the music's not nearly as good as it could have been. So Marco said, yeah, you know, we have some technical difficulties, it's not happening. I said, well, man, the recording has to proceed. But I never did look at the story, and it's mostly because of how my father thought about things, and he, not intentionally, but through his behavior and his actions and his words, he taught us how to think about these things. I always think about him in human terms, not in black and white terms, because this story is a story that has existed all over the world in various iterations at different times. So the music has to be successful, an emotional impact. And the emotional impact is about, well, the story. Former slaves moved to the Oklahoma territories because they wouldn't be subject to the race laws that existed in America at the time, because Oklahoma was not actually a state. So they were able to create businesses and have other friends create businesses and have relationships with the businesses where the dollars stayed in the Black community. Therefore, everyone was wildly successful. So that is a happy story, an optimistic story. So the music has to have optimism. It has to have the smell of opportunity. And then there's the seething resentment of the whites, not all the whites, but a significant number of the whites who are, you know, used to be in a similar economic situation. And that's when, to me, the story becomes Othello. Because when you read Othello with adult eyes, when I read it when I was 15, you know, what did I know? I was an idiot. But when I read it in my 30s, he doesn't hate Othello because he's Black. Iago resents Othello because he believes that people who look like Othello should not have the things that he had. So it was not the resentment of his skin, it was the resentment of a person of his skin color having the finest woman in town and the top position in town. And when you think about what Tulsa was ultimately about, it was a group of men saying, those people should not have what they have. They were slaves. And to accept them means we have to destroy all the lies and all the narratives that our grandfathers and our great-grandfathers taught us about why there were slaves. And that is an unacceptable situation for us. So we need to remove this. This has to be removed. And that changes the tenor of the music. Suddenly becomes not a localized thing, it becomes a universal story. So thinking about all of these things, I wrote all of this music. And this was Marco and I's first argument, because he's like, man, you haven't even seen the movie yet. I'm like, bro, the music's gonna work. It's gonna work. Man, you haven't seen the movie yet. Man, these are universal themes. So there was other music that I had to write, which would not have, there was no way I could have written some of the music that Marco made me write without seeing the film. But I knew that these things would work. And a large portion of that music is actually used in the film a lot. So the story is the story I've known. My grandfather told me about this story, so I knew about the story. But my idea was to try to find, the only way, the thing that I love about the movie and what Marco and Stanley did was that they didn't moralize. Because when you're telling these stories, I mean, I watch a lot of documentaries. There's that point where the documentarian or the people they hire start saying, this was horrible and it should never have happened. And it should never have happened and it was horrible. The story itself tells that. You don't need to double down on that. So there was no moralizing. So with the music, because of that, I was able to just create music that reflected human conditions of happiness, sorrow, optimism, pain. And then the one that I really like is Aftermath. because it was the visualization of the sun rising and all of these Black people in Tulsa seeing 38 blocks completely destroyed, dead people in the street, loved ones carted off to jail, billions of dollars or hundreds of millions of dollars in property just eviscerated in the nighttime. And what must that have felt like? So the song Aftermath is a reflection of that.
If I could just pull that thread just very quickly and very briefly, what's great about that moment, and it's one of the really evocative moments that Branford wrote, having not seen that section that we had edited at that time, and that section of the film, that act in my creative room, we were calling Aftermath. And that just sort of offers, I think, what Branford, you have said about some of the universal emotions and themes. Two different creative artists understanding something about the moment, calling it the same thing, and it works like a hand in a glove.
And that draws me to my next question, is your communication style. Because I think this is something that a lot of artists who try to transition into the world of composing fail to understand, that it's not about their artistry, it's about the story you're telling and matching on that narrative. So how did you two communicate to tell this story the way you envisioned it, but that met both your needs? You know what I mean?
I'll just say this, and I mean, Branford alluded to, I mean, it was not an ideal scheduling, because he hadn't seen the work, but he created music, and I would even make it akin, Branford, I've not said this to you, to kind of being a jazz quartet or a jazz band, kind of playing off each other. So Branford wrote music, and really evocative, as he said, and some of my favorite, that speaks to the aspiration and joy and accomplishment. And so then bringing that into the edit invited me to see the content of what we had edited differently. So that in that way, Branford communicated through his instrumentation, through his voice. Later on, when there was more music that needed to be written, so we could get rid of all the temp music, I then presented Branford with the actual film, that text, and that was my voice. And so I think on one level, I don't know how you feel about this, Branford, but on one level, yeah, we're both able to talk to each other verbally, but we express each other through our creative mediums.
It's always preferable to write to what you see.
Right.
I mean, there's so much you can do, because there are universal themes in all good stories, but then there's certain specificities, like I call them the battle scenes, but the battle scenes when the riot starts, there was no way I was going to be able to write music that would have accurately reflected that, having not seen the scenes. So once Marco got it together and started sending me those scenes, suddenly what was at that time kind of a traditional New Orleans style or a 20s style suddenly became very orchestral in nature. And I mean, it's a documentary, it's not a feature-length film, so it's not like I'm gonna say, yeah, I'm gonna call it North Carolina Symphony and we're gonna nail this. I mean, so then I have to pull on my old, production chops, using sequencers and sound modules and all of these things to recreate. And I mean, that's the hardest part, is to make the sound as authentic as you can. And as I started to send that stuff to Marco, I think he really liked that stuff, and then he encouraged me to do more and more of that. So there's these three tiers. There's the 20s style, there's the string quartet stuff that I thought I really wanted to have live strings, and I knew we couldn't hire 16 pieces, so I did write some music featuring string quartet. But then there's the other stuff, the sound module stuff, that really allowed me to let my imagination run wild.
And you're saying
kind of limitless.
You couldn't hire the 16 players. Was that COVID related or budget related?
No, it's budget related. I didn't even ask. I mean, it's just, look, it's a documentary.
Just the reality of what you had.
It's a reality of you doing documentaries. You have to be reasonable. It probably was also COVID related. I didn't even think about that. I never considered the idea of actually trying to do that, because I mean, in some of this music, there's timpani, is bass drum, brass section, woodwind section. So it's not really a 16 piece. It's suddenly 35 pieces, 40 pieces. And that stuff is expensive. And I knew better than to ask, but I knew that that was a sound that would have represented the scenes that we were seeing. You know, because sometimes I want to throw things at the television where there'll be some dramatic scene in like a documentary that features Black Americans. So suddenly there's like a woman humming tunes in the background going, woo, with a guitar. I'm like, no,
Yes.
no. So it was just great to have this moment to not just, you know, throw shit at the television and say, yeah, we're not doing that. We're doing this. And,
Right.
and Marco agreed with it in the end, which I was relieved that he agreed. And we got to make some noise in a different way.
Exactly. Not the cliche gospel.
Yes,
thing.
that's it. No, not the cliche faux gospel thing.
Yes. Got it.
Let's not get it twisted.
That's right. There's an authenticity to gospel. I get it.
Yes, there can be, and that is not it.
Right.
Well, Branford, remember the other, point that, not really contention, because I didn't disagree with you, but you staked very much that there wasn't going to, just because there was a sequence that was contemporary or protest or whatever, it was not going to be
Right.
hip hop based or rap based, which is also a kind of cliche that is just easily laid over, and people have come to think that's the way we should see that, but instead a different musical, voice or quality to express those moments.
Yeah, we've just become very fragmented. And I mean, we meaning Americans. I mean,
Sure.
it's like what I do with my students. It's a very funny thing. It's very quick too. Would you say that Black Americans have more social freedoms in 2021 or in 1961? And clearly the answer is 2021. So now, let's look at the top 100 music chart, top album records of the year in 1961. And you have, or you're like any of those years, not 1961, that's too late. Let's say 1967.
Yeah, a little later for Motown era.
Yeah. Well, Motown was around in 61, but 1967, you have like, the Jackson, well, not yet, they're close, but Diana Ross.
Yeah.
And then you have Charlie Pride singing country music. You have the Fifth Dimension singing white pop, whatever you want to call that. Lola Falana has hits. Sammy Davis Jr. has hits. Ray Stevens, who is not Black, is telling jokes, and he has joke songs. When you look at the top 100, there was so much diversity in the music while there was less diversity socially. And for whatever reason, bad luck, irony, now that we have all this great social diversity, there is so much musical uniformity that it's stunning to an old person like me. So whenever you see a bunch of young Black kids in a protest movement, the first thing everybody says is, get a hip hop tune. And I'm like, man, Black people didn't invent social protest. I mean, Martin Luther nailed his protests against the Catholic Church. That's like 700 years ago or something. I mean, just get music that reflects the humanity of the protest rather than just going for the cliche. And yay, Marco agreed with me. Thank you, Marco.
Well, all this creative talking, I mean, at the end of the day, I guess this question goes to Marco. Did you have full control of telling this story the way you envisioned, or were there any challenges in the process to deal with?
Well, film is a collaborative medium, and broadcast means that somebody else ultimately has a final say. But I feel pretty satisfied with the realization of my vision. And I'll say it this way: when I first started making the film in October 2020, the seed for the film was this was going to be a film that was going to make a case for reparations. Now, that didn't mean I was going to adjudicate that. It just meant that I was going to make a case for it. I didn't say how I was going to do it. And so I was able to describe and explain and present to the collaborators or to the people who had final say what my intention was and why. And it's very explicit in many ways. And so I'd have to say that no, I think that in this one, a cast of thousands to make it during COVID, the biggest challenges of trying to make a film in a very, very tight schedule. And Branford and I have alluded to not really having the initial time to, collaborate with the composition, the musical compositions. But no, this one I feel very proud of because it does what I set out to do.
Did the 100th anniversary play a role in that
Oh yeah.
timeline?
Oh yeah. I mean, and understandably and gratefully so, brings a lot of attention to something that, as you noted, Michael, you only learned about a couple of years ago, that lots of people were not aware of it until Watchmen or Lovecraft Country.
Mm.
This was one of several different documentaries made for broadcast entities, and almost all, conventional broadcast channels had some form of documentary. So the 100th anniversary was significant in terms of the shortness of schedule, but in a lot of ways, it made it possible to get it done.
Well, I think with the timing of this, it's interesting because these days there's so many opportunities for meaningful story like this to reach its intended audience. How did you land at the History Channel as a home for this documentary film?
I came late and I finished late. So Russell Westbrook, triple double fame, had an idea about this from the time that he was on the team in Oklahoma. He approached a production company entitled Blackfin. They reached out to Stanley Nelson, who had done a film called Boss about Black entrepreneurs and had about a 7-minute section of Tulsa in there and was very interested. But Stanley was in the process of making a film about Attica. He and I had co-directed a film about historically Black colleges. He reached out to me. It fit into my schedule. And so all of the who in this game, you pitch it to lots of people, history like the concept, and that's how it ended up on History.
Yeah, well, it turned out wonderful. I mean, what would each of you like to work on next after this? Is there?
I mean, a movie about clowns. I don't know. I mean, come on, I like working.
Yeah,
I like working.
Yeah, I mean,
you mean in the same vein? Because there's so many stories. If you mean
that's what I was going to say, because you
there's
covered so many
stories.
crafts.
Wilmington, 1890. That's an amazing story. It is probably the only. It's the only government overthrow other than the Civil War in the history of the United States. And it's a great story on multiple levels. One of the leaders of the Fusion Party that initiated this whole people's movement for lower middle class people who are always in the majority was an old Confederate general. It's an amazing story. And there was essentially an election held, and the Fusion Party won the majority of the seats. And not long after that, there was a complete and utter insurrection, a successful insurrection, and the federal government did nothing about it.
This plays into the bigger picture of how history tends to repeat itself when no one learns history, or those who don't learn history.
Right. Well, nobody wanted to learn that history. I mean, I just read an article in the newspaper, in the New York Times, about a restaurant in a small town in Mississippi, and someone was doing a documentary about Mississippi, and there was a Black guy who worked there, and they said, "Oh, ask him," because in the minds of the locals, he was one of the good ones. And they interviewed him, and he told the truth of what it's like to be a Black person working in this restaurant. And the person who did the documentary said, "Look, man, I'm going to edit this stuff out." And he goes, "No, you want to leave all of that in there." And when the documentary came out and the white resident saw him, the sheriff found him and beat him. And he was no longer working at the restaurant because, I mean, a lot of people looked at our political situation in the last 5 years and said, how is this even possible? And I mean, there's a third of the country that created a complete counter narrative to their own behavior and believed it almost instantly. And when forced to deal with the reality from the other side of what it was, they still rejected it. So there are all these stories that are out there, and ultimately that's the story. The story isn't almost the action, it's the circular logic that people will do to twist themselves inside and out to justify behavior that is abhorrent.
And affirm their own beliefs.
Yeah, at the expense of reality.
Exactly, and truth.
So there's a bunch of stories like that, and they're not just Black stories. You know, there's like, you know, the treatment of the Irish when they came over here, the persecution of the Italians when they came over here. Sacco and Vanzetti would be a really great story. But so I mean, there's all.
I think the common theme there is, aren't they all considered minorities at those periods?
Yes.
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 That struggle.
Yes.
Well, as we wrap this up, I have one last question I want to bring up, and that's, do you have any advice or maybe learning moments to share for a young aspiring filmmaker and or composer?
Composition for film is unique, because your job is to create an emotional padding. You know, well, in documentary filmmaking, it's even more difficult because they need a lot more music, because it's just a narrator. But the whole idea of the music is that you are there to support the dialogue and the actors, and not just that, in the external shots, in everything. And you have to represent that. And if you think of it in terms of this is my music, yeah, you really might not want to venture into this, because it is a completely collaborative effort, and you have to accept the fact that the director and other people in the team might have a very different vision for your music than you have. And your consolation prize will be the soundtrack. And if you're not okay with that, then don't do this, because it's never going to be about you. Because if people notice the music, then you failed, which is really ironic, but that's just very clear. Because one of my high school teachers told me that, and I didn't really believe him. And he said, well, it was 1976. So he said, well, go ask your friends who like Jaws. Go ask your regular friends who like Jaws, and they won't even, if you ask them what they liked about the music, they'll never mention the fact that those two notes that, who wrote that? Did John Williams write that? Those two notes that John Williams wrote,
yes,
created the Pavlovian response. He says the best part about it is that if you ask any of them what made them freak out, they will never mention those two notes. And I'm 16 and I'm saying Dr. Bro's full of crap. And I went to all my regular friends and said, you like that movie? Oh, it was great. I was scared out of my wits. What do you think made you jump? I don't know, man. It was just like, you know, you just knew the shark was coming. I said, well, how did you know the shark was coming? I don't know. And that was like a thing. So I was 16 years old and went, wow, they don't even hear it. So I had that lesson early, you know, and I'd like to thank Dr. Bro for that. That's great. So I'm gonna stop talking now. Marco, your turn.
You know, I think there are different, you know, types of in relationships between filmmakers and composers. So there are very different spaces for documentary. When I was learning documentary in my early stages of documentary, music in documentary was considered a no-no. We were to represent reality for what it was, and music had the potential to manipulate, as Branford noted. Two notes can create a certain emotion, and so that's how I was raised. Now I think that broadcast documentaries today really rely a lot on music because they are afraid that people are going to turn the channel. So there's the use of music to hold the emotion and create the tension so explicitly. And so what I tell my students, being a professor of filmmaking, is when you work with a composer, you should have a clarity of where you would like music to be and why. you should have some ability, even if it's not your vocabulary, to say, I think I'd like to have this instrumentation or that instrumentation. I often say, don't present temp music, because the composer is not, you don't want your composer to imitate what they've heard. And this is gonna, I say to them, be wary of composers. They want to make music. They want to create as much music as possible, but your job is to put in only the music you need, not to satisfy their ego to kind of create music. The film Branford and I did, however, is very much about music because of the kind of the space that it exists in. Other documentaries I make, and I hope to have a chance, more independent, I'd ask Branford to write the music, and it would be very much more, located, and therefore in many ways that much more impact.
Wow. Thanks, Branford and Marco, for sharing your time with us. That was incredible. Please feel free to check out another edition or any of our editions of ASCAP Screen Time on ASCAP.com. And bye for now.